For 6 months, the people of Harlan Creek bought their water from a woman who didn't exist. Not officially, anyway. According to the Consolidated Mountain Energy Company, Norah Prescott had vacated the Black Ridge Survey Camp in the autumn of 1887, the same week the security fences went up. According to the county register, her forwarding address was listed as unknown, presumed departed. According to every map the company printed and distributed to the territorial offices, the canyon where Norah had spent 3 years measuring rock strata and cataloging mineral deposits was now a restricted zone, closed to the public for reasons of geological instability. Stay with me, because none of that was true. Norah Prescott hadn't left Black Ridge. She'd gone deeper into it, and what she built there, over the course of 1 year in near total solitude, would eventually sustain more than 200 people and embarrass every official who'd signed off on the closure. But that came later. To understand what Norah did, you need to understand who she was before the canyon was taken from her. Norah was 29 years old the year the company came for Black Ridge. She stood 5'6", with hands roughened from years of gripping transit rods and rock hammers, and a face burned dark from working under open sky at altitude. Her hair, when she let it down, which was rarely, fell to her shoulders the color of creek-bottom sand. She wore men's boots because no one made surveyor's boots for women, and she'd long since stopped caring who noticed. She had come west from Pennsylvania in 1882, the year her father died. Samuel Prescott had been a mining engineer who'd spent 20 years crawling through coal shafts in the Allegheny foothills. He was a quiet man, thin as a fence rail, with hands that never fully came clean of coal dust and eyes that noticed everything about the rock around him. He'd taught his only daughter everything he knew, not because he'd wanted a son and gotten the next best thing, but because Norah had asked. She'd asked about rock formations the way other girls asked about dress patterns. She'd asked about load-bearing walls and ventilation shafts the way other children asked about candy. Her father had answered every question. By the time Norah was 14, she could read a geological cross-section the way a schoolteacher reads a primer. By 18, she could estimate the bearing capacity of a limestone shelf by tapping it with a hammer and listening to the resonance. Samuel had also taught her something less technical, but equally important, that the earth was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be understood. Every mine collapse I've ever seen, he told her once, sitting on the porch of the Spruce Street house while rain drummed on the tin roof, happened because someone was too impatient to listen to what the rock was telling them. When the black lung took Samuel at 53, a slow, choking decline that lasted through one Pennsylvania winter and ended on a gray April morning with Norah holding his hand. She sold the house on Spruce Street, packed his surveying instruments into an oak trunk, and bought a one-way ticket to Colorado Territory. She had no husband, no prospects anyone back east would recognize, and no intention of ever returning. What she had was a set of skills that most men spent decades acquiring, and the quiet certainty that she could put them to use somewhere that mattered. She found work with the Territorial Geological Survey within 3 months. It wasn't easy. The head surveyor, a man named Franklin Tate, had laughed out loud when she'd walked into the Denver office carrying a Jacobs staff and a set of vernier compasses that were better calibrated than his own. "Ma'am," he'd said, "this is field work, mountains, snow, mules." "I know what field work is," Norah had replied. "I also know that your published elevation for Monarch Pass is off by 47 feet. I checked it twice on the way here." She was hired the following Monday. Over the next 5 years, Norah mapped more of the Black Ridge Range than any surveyor before her. She cataloged 7 previously unrecorded cave systems, identified 2 geothermal vents that heated underground streams to near boiling, and produced a set of cross-section drawings so precise that a professor at the Colorado School of Mines requested copies for his classroom. She also acquired a dog. Flint had appeared at her survey camp one October evening, a rangy, gray-coated creature with amber eyes and ribs showing through his fur like the ridgeline she'd been sketching that afternoon. He was half-starved and wary, more wolf than dog in both appearance and temperament. Norah set down a tin plate of salt pork and didn't look at him directly. By morning, the plate was clean, and Flint was lying 3 feet from the dead campfire, watching her with those amber eyes. He never left. And then, in the autumn of 1887, neither did she. The Consolidated Mountain Energy Company arrived in Black Ridge in August. They came with lawyers, not geologists. They came with writs of access and territorial easements signed by officials Norah had never heard of, for purposes that were never clearly explained to anyone who lived or worked in the canyon. What Norah understood, what she could read in the rock the way other people read newspapers, was that the company wanted the geothermal vents. Not for study. For power. The steam could drive turbines. The hot water could be piped. The canyon floor, with its fractured basalt and its network of natural fissures, sat on top of enough thermal energy to light every home from Harlan Creek to Junction City. But instead of negotiating with the people who knew the land, the company declared it dangerous, unstable, a hazard to public safety. They posted notices. They sent surveyors of their own. Men who couldn't read a compass rose without instructions. They erected chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire and hired guards from Denver to patrol the perimeter. By September, every rancher, miner, and homesteader within 2 miles of Black Ridge had been relocated. Most went quietly. A few protested to the territorial office and were told the matter was settled. Norah Prescott did not go quietly, and she did not protest. She did something no one expected. She packed 14 days of provisions onto her mule, a stout, ill-tempered animal named Buckle, and on the night of September 19th, 1887, she walked straight into the restricted zone through a fracture in the eastern cliff face that wasn't on any map the company possessed. Flint walked beside her, silent as smoke. The people of Harlan Creek had opinions about this. Jonas Wheeler, who ran the general store, called it the most fool-headed thing a woman's done since Eve picked that apple. Garrett Dawes, the farrier, said she was trespassing on company land and would be dragged out in irons within a week. Martha Pruitt, who owned the boarding house and considered herself a friend to Norah, said more gently that the poor girl had finally cracked under the pressure of living alone too long. "It's a shame," Martha told anyone who'd listen. "Smart woman like that, throwing her life away over some rocks." Frank Jessup, who'd lost his own homestead to the company's fencing, said nothing at all. He just looked toward Black Ridge with his jaw set and his eyes narrow, and when someone asked him what he thought, he said, "I think she knows those mountains better than the men who stole them." That was the last anyone spoke of Norah Prescott for quite some time. Inside the ridge, Norah moved with the certainty of someone walking through their own home in the dark. She followed the eastern fracture for nearly a mile, descending steadily through passages she had mapped herself 3 years earlier. The air changed as she went deeper, cooler at first, then warmer, then carrying the faint sulfur scent of the geothermal vents she'd cataloged in her survey notes. Flint's claws clicked on the stone floor. Buckle snorted, but kept moving. On the second day, Norah reached what she had always called the cathedral. It was a natural chamber, roughly 160 feet long, 80 feet wide, and nearly 50 feet high at its vaulted center. The ceiling was fractured in 3 places, and through those fractures, Narrow channels worn by millennia of water and wind, pale shafts of daylight fell like columns in a church. The floor was dry sandstone, smooth and level. Along the western wall, a hot spring emerged from a crack in the rock at a steady 142 degrees Fahrenheit, pooling in a natural basin before draining into a channel that disappeared back into the mountain. Norah had discovered the cathedral in 1885. She'd spent 2 days measuring it, sketching it, and thinking about what it could become. At the time, those thoughts had been idle speculation, the kind of thing a person thinks when they stand inside a space so beautiful it seems to demand a purpose. Now, standing in the pale light with Flint at her heel and everything she owned on a mule's back, the speculation became a plan. She would not fight the company. She would not plead with officials. She would build something they couldn't touch in a place they didn't know existed. She would build it underground. The first night was the worst. Norah had slept in caves before, short naps during multi-day survey expeditions, always with the knowledge that camp was waiting above. This was different. The cathedral's silence was total, a silence so deep it had texture, pressing against her eardrums like cotton. The mirror shafts showed nothing but black sky. The hot spring hissed and trickled. Buckle stamped nervously in the passage outside, and Norah lay on bare sandstone with her bedroll beneath her and her father's compass on a cord around her neck, and she wondered if she'd made the worst mistake of her life. Flint settled it. The dog walked in a slow circle, sniffed the warm stone near the spring, lay down with a sigh that echoed off the chamber walls, and closed his eyes. If the dog wasn't worried, Norah decided, then she wouldn't be either. She slept. In the morning, the mirror shafts caught the first sunlight and threw it across the chamber floor in pale gold ribbons, and Norah stood in the light and understood, with a certainty she felt in her chest, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then she went to work. The first 3 months were the hardest labor of Norah's life, and Norah Prescott had never been a stranger to hard work. She began with water. The hot spring was too hot to drink, but Norah knew from her father's teachings that if you ran scalding water through a series of shallow stone channels exposed to cooler air, it would lose temperature gradually without losing volume. She spent 2 weeks carving a zigzag channel into the sandstone floor, each leg roughly 12 feet long, each turn dropping the water over a small lip to increase surface area. By the time the water reached the collection basin she'd hollowed at the end, it ran at a comfortable 68 degrees and tasted clean. Next came light. The 3 ceiling fractures admitted daylight, but only into narrow shafts that illuminated small patches of the chamber floor. Norah solved this with mirrors. She'd brought 4 small looking glasses from her survey kit, and she angled them at precise intervals within the fractures, bouncing sunlight from surface to surface until it spread across the chamber in wide, warm pools. On a clear day, the cathedral was brighter than most cabins. She built sleeping quarters along the eastern wall, using flat stones stacked dry and chinked with clay from the spring basin. She constructed a ventilation system by clearing 2 additional fractures that she'd identified in her original survey, narrow enough to be invisible from outside, but wide enough to allow airflow when she carved angled baffles into the stone. The draft pulled warm, stale air upward and drew cooler air in through the eastern passage, creating a steady circulation that kept the chamber at roughly 58 degrees year-round. 58 degrees. In a territory where winter surface temperatures routinely dropped to 30 below zero, Norah Prescott was living in a space that never dipped below 55. She planted a garden. The hot spring deposited mineral-rich sediment along its banks. Norah mixed this sediment with composted mule dung and sandstone dust, creating a growing medium she spread in shallow stone troughs beneath the brightest mirror-lit sections of the chamber. She'd brought seeds, turnips, carrots, onions, lettuce, and a small pouch of winter wheat, and she planted them in rows as neat as any Pennsylvania kitchen garden. In the mirror light and the steady warmth of the geothermal air, the seeds germinated in 9 days. Flint watched all of this from his preferred spot near the spring basin, where the warm stone made a comfortable bed. His amber eyes followed Norah as she worked, and when she paused to rest, he pressed his gray head against her knee without being asked. "Just us, boy," she told him one evening, sitting with her back against the chamber wall and a tin cup of spring water in her calloused hand. "Just us and the mountain." Flint's tail moved once against the stone. That was enough. By January of 1888, Norah had expanded beyond the cathedral. She discovered, or rather, she followed her own old survey notes to, a network of 7 additional chambers connected by natural passages. Some were small, no larger than a ranch house parlor. Others were enormous, with ceilings lost in darkness and floors covered in fine sand deposited by ancient water. She cleared paths between them, marked each passage with chalk symbols she'd invented herself, and began assigning purposes. Chamber 2 became a root cellar, its constant 52-degree temperature ideal for storing the vegetables now growing in steady succession in the cathedral garden. Chamber 3, which had its own small geothermal vent, became a drying room for herbs and the strips of venison Norah hunted on careful, pre-dawn trips to the surface. Chamber 5, the largest after the cathedral, she left empty for the time being. She didn't know yet what it would become, but she had a feeling she would need the space. Above ground, the winter of 1888 was brutal. Temperatures in Harlan Creek dropped to -37 degrees in February. Livestock died in barns that weren't insulated well enough. Pipes froze. The Consolidated Mountain Energy Company, which had promised the territory reliable power from its new operations in Black Ridge, failed to deliver. Rolling blackouts struck Harlan Creek, then Junction City, then the mining camps farther up the valley. The company blamed the weather. The territorial office blamed the company. The people of Harlan Creek blamed everyone and huddled in the dark. And somewhere beneath the mountain, Norah Prescott ate a fresh salad by mirror light and scratched Flint behind the ears. She didn't gloat. That wasn't her way. But she did allow herself a quiet thought, spoken aloud to no one but the dog. They could have asked. They could have worked with the land instead of against it. Papa always said the mountain will give you everything you need if you bother to listen. Flint blinked his amber eyes. "I know," Norah said. "I'm preaching. Let's check the wheat." The first outsider arrived in March. His name was Tom Shelley, and he was 12 years old. He'd been hunting rabbits along the eastern cliff when he'd noticed the faint shimmer of warm air rising from a crack in the rock, a heat signature that didn't belong in a landscape still locked in ice. Being 12 and curious, he followed it. Norah found him, standing at the entrance to the cathedral with his mouth hanging open, staring at the mirror-lit garden, the stone sleeping quarters, the zigzag cooling channel, and the dog lying by the warm spring like he owned the place. "Ma'am," the boy said, when he could speak. "Are you a ghost?" "No," Norah said. "Are you hungry?" He was. She fed him turnip soup and bread made from her own ground wheat, and she walked him back to the eastern passage before dark. "You can come back," she told him. "But don't tell anyone. Not yet. Tom Shelley lasted 11 days before he told his mother. His mother told Martha Pruitt. Martha Pruitt told the entire boarding house over supper. And by the end of March 1888, the story of Norah Prescott's underground settlement was the only thing anyone in Harlan Creek could talk about. The reactions were predictable. Jonas Wheeler said it was nonsense. A woman living in a cave, he scoffed, leaning against the counter of his general store. Growing vegetables, underground. Next you'll tell me she's got a piano down there. Garrett Dawes said it was illegal. That's company land, he reminded anyone who'd listen. She's trespassing. They'll send the marshals. Martha Pruitt, who had called Norah cracked 6 months earlier, was quieter now. Tom Shelley's no liar, she said, and he came home with fresh lettuce in his coat pocket. Fresh lettuce in March. Frank Jessup, the homesteader who'd lost his place to the company, said what he'd always said. She knows those mountains. But it was the blackouts that changed everything. In April, the company's power system failed completely. A steam pipe ruptured somewhere inside the Black Ridge operation. Norah could have told them exactly where, if they'd asked, and the entire grid went dark. Harlan Creek lost electricity for 19 days. The general store lost $300 worth of meat to spoilage. The schoolhouse closed. The doctor's office ran on kerosene. And Tom Shelley's mother, desperate and practical, asked her son to take her to the woman in the mountain. Norah met them at the eastern fracture, lantern in hand, flint at her side. I can't house the whole town, she said, before anyone asked, but I can show you what I've done, and I can teach you the principles. They're not complicated. My father learned most of them from his father, and he was just a man who paid attention to rock. Over the next 3 weeks, Norah led small groups through the settlement. She showed them the cooling channel and explained thermal gradient, how water loses roughly 2 degrees per foot of exposed surface when the ambient air is cooler than the source. She showed them the mirror system and explained the geometry of reflected light, how a 6-inch mirror angled at 37 degrees could illuminate a space 40 feet away if positioned correctly within a natural light shaft. She showed them the garden and explained what her father had called mineral farming, the practice of using geothermal sediment as fertilizer, something miners in the Allegheny foothills had stumbled onto decades ago and never thought to formalize. She showed them Chamber 5, still empty, and said, "This is for you, if you want it, but I won't do the work for you. I'll teach, and you'll build." Jonas Wheeler came on the 4th week. He stood in the cathedral for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Norah, and his face did something complicated, embarrassment and awe fighting for space on a man not accustomed to either. "I called you crazy," he said. "You called me worse than that," Norah said without anger. "I did," Jonas admitted. "And I was wrong. Every word of it." "Then learn something," Norah said. "That's all I ask." By the summer of 1888, Chamber 5 was no longer empty. 31 residents of Harlan Creek had established a secondary settlement inside the mountain, using techniques Norah taught them and tools they'd brought from the surface. They built stone-walled living quarters, expanded the garden into 3 additional growing areas, and installed a mirror system of their own in a previously unlit passage that Norah had identified but never developed. The work was hard. Not everyone stayed. But those who did discovered what Norah had known since she was a girl in Pennsylvania, sitting beside her father in the cool of a coal mine shaft, while he explained how the earth itself could keep you alive if you understood its language. Garrett Dawes, The farrier, who'd wanted to call the marshals, became the settlement's blacksmith. He set up a forge near one of the smaller geothermal vents and discovered that the constant heat supply made his work more efficient than any surface forge he'd ever used. He never mentioned marshals again. Martha Pruitt organized the kitchens and the food storage. She turned out to have a gift for managing the drying room in Chamber 3, hanging herbs and meat strips with a precision that rivaled Norah's own. Frank Jessup, who'd been quiet through everything, proved to be the most talented builder of the group. He designed a stone aqueduct that carried cooled water from the cathedral spring to every occupied chamber, eliminating the need for individual cooling channels. When Norah saw his work, she smiled for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Your father was a builder?" she asked him. "My grandfather," Frank said, "stonemason, came over from Ayrshire." "Inherited knowledge," Norah said, and Frank nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The Consolidated Mountain Energy Company learned about the settlement in October of 1888. They sent a representative, a lawyer from Denver named Aldrich Coombs, who arrived in Harlan Creek expecting to deliver eviction notices. Instead, he found a town that no longer depended on the company for power, water, or food. He found a schoolteacher who held classes by mirror light 50 feet below the surface. He found a blacksmith whose forge hadn't gone cold in 4 months. He found gardens producing fresh vegetables in November. And he found Norah Prescott standing at the entrance to the eastern passage with a copy of her original geological survey in one hand and a territorial land use statute in the other. "The company's easement covers the surface and the first 40 feet of subsurface," Norah said calmly. "I checked. Twice. Everything below 60 feet remains territorial public land. It was never included in your filing because your surveyors didn't know it existed." She paused. "I did." Coombs returned to Denver. The company filed a challenge. The challenge failed. Norah's surveys were more accurate than anything the company had produced, and the territorial judge, who had spent the previous winter in a house without heat because the company's power grid had collapsed, was not inclined to rule in their favor. The settlement stayed. 12 years later, in the spring of 1900, Norah Prescott sat on a flat stone outside the eastern passage and watched the sun come up over Black Ridge. She was 41. Her hair had gone silver at the temples. Her hands, always calloused, were now mapped with small white scars from a decade of stonework. Beside her lay Ember, Flint's granddaughter, a gray-coated dog with the same amber eyes and the same quiet watchfulness, though she was softer around the edges, having grown up in a world that was less lonely than the one her grandfather had known. Below her, inside the mountain, 187 people lived in what was now called Prescott's Hollow. The original 8 chambers had expanded to 23. There were workshops and storerooms, a library stocked with books donated from as far away as St. Louis, a schoolroom where children learned geology alongside reading and arithmetic, and a medical clinic where the doctor worked by mirror light so steady he said it was better than any window. The company still operated on the surface. They'd never stopped, but their power grid had failed twice more in the intervening years, and each time the people of Prescott's Hollow had simply continued their lives without interruption. The geothermal vents didn't care about corporate mismanagement. The mirror shafts didn't flicker during storms. The gardens grew regardless of what happened above. Jonas Wheeler had become the settlement's most vocal advocate. He traveled to territorial meetings and spoke about geothermal principles with the conviction of a man making up for lost time. He always began the same way. "I called her crazy. I want that on the record. I was the loudest fool in Harlan Creek, and Norah Prescott never once threw it back in my face." Garrett Dawes still worked his forge. His son had taken over most of the horseshoeing, but Garrett himself had become an expert in stone-cutting tools, designing chisels and drills specifically suited to the sandstone of Black Ridge. He'd published a small pamphlet on the subject, Practical Stonework for Subterranean Construction, that had sold 600 copies in Colorado alone. Frank Jessup had married Martha Pruitt's daughter and built their home in Chamber 12, a space he'd expanded himself with an arched ceiling so precisely fitted that the territorial engineer who'd inspected it said it rivaled professional masonry. Frank still didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The walls spoke for him. Norah taught. That was what she did now, mostly. She'd trained 14 apprentice surveyors, 9 of them women, and sent them out to map other mountains, other cave systems, other places where the Earth's own warmth could sustain life if someone bothered to listen for it. 3 of her students had established similar settlements, one in Wyoming, one in Montana, one in southern Utah. Each one sent letters. Each one had questions. Norah answered everyone. Tom Shelley, the rabbit-hunting boy who'd been the first outsider to find her, was 24 now and worked as a geological surveyor for the territory. He credited Norah with everything he knew, and he'd written a formal report recommending that the territorial government fund geothermal surveys across the Rocky Mountain region. The report cited Prescott's Hollow as proof of concept. It used Norah's original cross-section drawings as illustrations. When Norah read it, she set it down carefully and stared at the chamber wall for a long time. And then she said to Ember, "He spelled basalt wrong on page 4. I'll write him about it." She kept her father's surveying instruments on a shelf in the cathedral, cleaned and oiled but no longer used. Beside them sat a single framed photograph of Samuel Prescott, taken in 1879. A thin man with kind eyes and coal dust permanently embedded in the lines of his face. "Knowledge isn't like gold, Papa," Norah said sometimes, when the cathedral was empty and only Ember was listening. "Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger." She'd heard him say it 100 times. She'd said it to her students 100 more. And every time, it was true. On the morning of her 41st birthday, Norah walked through the settlement with Ember at her side and a cup of spring water in her hand. She passed the gardens, where winter wheat grew in mineral-rich soil under reflected sunlight, the same crop she'd first planted alone in the dark. She passed the forge, where the steady hiss of geothermal steam marked Garrett's early start. She passed the schoolroom, where children sat in rows of stone benches, and a young teacher, one of Norah's first students, explained how light behaves when it strikes a polished surface at an angle. She climbed the eastern passage and emerged into the dawn. The air was cold, mid-March in the Colorado mountains, but down below, the settlement held steady at 58 degrees, the same temperature it had held since the day she'd first walked in with a mule, a dog, and a plan she hadn't fully believed in herself. Black Ridge rose above her, unchanged. The company's fences still lined the surface. Their equipment still scarred the canyon floor. But beneath all of it, in chambers carved by water and time and finished by human hands, something better existed. Something they couldn't fence off or shut down or declare unstable. Ember leaned against Norah's leg. Norah rested her hand on the dog's warm gray head. "They tried to bury me under this mountain," she said quietly, to the dog in the dawn and the memory of her father. "So I made it my home." She finished her water, turned, and walked back into the light below.